We're going to talk about the plasma membrane today, which is also known as the cell membrane and the phospholipid bilayer. There's three major functions to the cell membrane, and the first one is that it defines the cell boundaries and it keeps things out and keeps things in. The second major function is that it's selectively permeable or semi-permeable. And what this means is it means that we actually can control what goes in and out. So if we want something to come in, we want to bring it in, we can do that. And if we want to get rid of something, we can do that. And it has to pass through proteins in order to do that in terms of the choice. So we have an intracellular side and an extracellular side. And so by tradition, we usually have extracellular outside at the top, and intracellular inside. So unless otherwise designated, you can assume this is the orientation. So this is extracellular and this is intracellular side. And then the third major function of the plasma membrane is it controls interactions with other cells. We call that sensitivity. It enables the cell to know what's going on around it. That includes things like identification, identifying themselves or identifying other cells, protection, knowing when to attack something if something is self or foreign, and also adhesion. It's how cells stick together. So if we take a look at the cell membrane in more detail, we notice that it's made out of lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins. So lipids make up the primary, almost 90 to 99% of the membrane. And the one that makes up the most of that is called the phospholipid. Now the phospholipid has a unique shape in that it has this hydrophilic head and these two hydrophobic tails. Now what this does is it makes phospholipids what we call amphipathic. Amphipathic simply means, it's the same root as amphibian, is it means that it has two different parts. So we have a part that loves water and we have a part that hates water. And so it makes sense that if I were to put these phospholipids into water, they're going to orientate in one of several ways. The one that's useful in biology is what's known as a bilayer, where we have the water-loving head oriented to the outside, which is filled with water, and also, you can see them here, also have those heads facing inside and putting their tails into the center, into the space between them. So that makes these heads happy because they love water and they're exposed to water on both sides. And it makes the tails happy because this is a very hydrophobic environment that enables them to, the lipid parts of the phospholipids, to be happy. Sometimes what we have is we also have what are known as cholesterol. This is a lipid, and also glycolipids. So cholesterol is embedded in the membrane. It can be either intracellularly or extracellularly on the face. And then what we have is this cholesterol actually influences the fluidity. How flexible, how squishy is the cell? Sometimes you want the cell to be very squishy, like blood cells, that enable it to squeeze into really small capillaries to deliver oxygen. Other times you want your cells to be kind of rigid, like skeletal cells, like bone cells. You want them to be a little bit more rigid. So you're going to change the concentration of cholesterol to affect that fluidity. The last type of lipid that we find is called a glycolipid. These are lipids, primarily phospholipids, that have sugars attached to them. So glyco tells me it's a sugar. And this enables us to, sugars on the surface, and they're always on the external surface, are usually about stickiness and protection. So making the cell stick together and also to protect them from foreign invaders. Okay, and the sugars that we see on the outside of our cell, including glycolipids, but also glycoproteins, which we're going to talk about in just a second, are sometimes lumped together and called the glycocalyx. The glycocalyx is the sugar cage or coat on the external surface of the cell. And again, it's primarily for protection and adhesion. So if we take a look at our proteins, so proteins are the next component. So we talked about the lipids, and there's three different types of lipids. You have phospholipids, cholesterol, and glycolipids. Then we have our proteins. Proteins are the other major important parts of the cell membrane. And we have two different types of proteins that we find. We find what are known as transmembrane proteins. These are proteins that extend through the membrane, trans across the membrane, maybe once, maybe twice, maybe 20 times, maybe 25 times. So it just depends. And these are proteins that can convey information from the outside in or from the inside out, because they have parts of themselves that extend through the membrane. So some that's exposed to the outside environment and some that's exposed to the inside environment. Oftentimes these transmembrane proteins also have sugars on them, right? So we have these glycoproteins that contribute to the glycocalyx as well. We also have a small percentage of peripheral proteins. These are intracellular proteins, and what they do is they help anchor the cell membrane to the cytoskeleton, to the internal environment of the cell. So we're going to spend most of our time talking about transmembrane proteins. Some functions of proteins in the cell, and we'll look at these in more depth in the different systems as well as in just a minute, is we have receptors. Receptors receive information. They let us know what's going on around us. Enzymes are going to help to process materials either in the extracellular environment or the intracellular environment. You have channels and gates, transport proteins. These enable things to get around, to get into the cell or possibly maybe outside the cell. You have cell identity markers. These are going to be cells or proteins that basically identify the cell to their neighbors. You can see this, for instance, has a sugar on it. And then we also have some cell adhesion molecules or cell adhesion proteins that enable the cell to adhere to other cells. So those are just some functions, and we'll talk about each one of those more in depth as we progress through the systems, but we're going to spend most of our time talking about membrane transport. So what we've looked at so far are the structure of the membrane. So you have your phospholipids and cholesterol and glycolipids, you have your proteins, and then you have your carbohydrates that are the glycolipids and the glycoproteins that form the glycocalyx on the external side of the membrane.